Will you join me in prayer? The words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, for these next 6 weeks, our principal preoccupation in worship is going to be on connections. Here in the Church of Jesus Christ, we understand that we are created for community. Our creation story in the book of Genesis reminds us that after God created the garden paradise and placed the first human in the midst of the garden to till and to keep it, God noticed that something was terribly wrong. Even though the garden was beautiful and bountiful and perfect, God understood right away that this earthling, this being created in the very image of God, could not thrive in isolation. And God said, "It is not good that the human should be alone. Come, I will make a suitable companion." We are created for community. Our deepest experiences of fulfillment come through those relationships that connect us to each other and to our God. The worst punishment that we can imagine is not waterboarding. It is not physical torture. It is not even capital punishment. The worst punishment that we can imagine is solitary confinement. We cannot thrive in isolation. For the next 6 weeks, we'll be focusing on Brené Brown's work, Daring Greatly, as a resource to help us think more deeply about those practices that help us live our lives with authentic connections. Connections that are not distorted or warped by the fear of shame or the need for certainty or the appearance of perfection. Authentic connections are those connections in which we have the courage to be vulnerable, believing that we are worthy of love and belonging even with all of our imperfections, that we are enough. Those authentic connections are what we all yearn for. They make our lives full and complete. They are the source of our deepest joy. They make it possible for us to live our lives with glad and generous hearts. Throughout this series, we're going to be following the stories of King David that are recorded in the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel, not because he was the perfect model of someone who dared greatly and embodied these practices of authentic connection, but because David modeled the vulnerability that reminds us that acknowledging our own imperfections is a prerequisite for experiencing the joy and the gratitude and the grace of authentic connections. Today, we are beginning our series on daring greatly by focusing on the practice of curiosity or mindfulness. The ability to wonder about and pay attention to what is without judgment. Without mindfulness, we are like lab rats in one of B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning experiments. Something happens in our environment that provokes a reaction in us, and we act on it. You say something critical about me, I feel hurt, and so I withdraw. You do something that offends me, I get angry, and so I lash out and attack you. You show affection to me, I feel wanted, and so I move into an illicit affair with you. Without mindfulness, we feel out of control. Without mindfulness, we act on the emotional responses that we have to whatever is happening in our environment. We are little more than lab rats in one of B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning experiments. The story of King David's affair with Bathsheba reads like a study in behavioral conditioning. The young and virile David is walking about on the roof of his palace when he sees a Hittite woman named Bathsheba bathing. He is aroused by her beauty and summons her to his bedroom. There is no inner dialogue going on in David's head about why he finds himself so affected by Bathsheba's beauty. There is no curiosity about why, with several wives already available in his own household, he felt drawn to this one woman who was already married and unavailable. There is no thinking through the long-term consequences of acting on the desire that he felt for Bathsheba. He was aroused by her beauty and summoned her to his bedchamber. Stimulus and response, cause and effect. The brilliant strategist, the courageous warrior, the distinguished leader is reduced to a lab rat. As we'll hear in the weeks ahead, terrible treachery and agonizing tragedy follow as a result of King David's affair with Bathsheba. Deceit, murder, fraud, rape, alienation, insurrection, war, and a deep, deep sense of sorrow all flow from this single mindless act of lust. But rather than shaming David, what if we could go back and invite David to become curious about the arousal that he felt in response to Bathsheba's beauty? What if, instead of simply acting on what he felt, David paused long enough to become mindful of all of the influences pressing on his life at that very moment? What if he didn't try to ignore the arousal that he felt when he gazed upon Bathsheba's beauty, but instead began asking himself why he felt so drawn to her at that particular moment? After all, David was king over all 12 of the tribes of Judah. All 12 of the tribes of Israel. The Israelites were a polygamous culture, meaning one man could have as many wives as he could support. And David had the resources to support a lot of wives. He was handsome, he was powerful, he was widely admired. He could have chosen practically any unmarried woman in the kingdom, and she and her family would have eagerly consented to marriage. If David had become curious instead of acting on his arousal, then perhaps he would have become mindful of the fact that this was the first time he was left behind, the first time he was home, while his soldiers were off at the frontier of their kingdom, engaged in combat on the field of battle. David was used to his role as warrior, but he was new to the role of king. He had commanded the admiration and the respect of his comrades for his fierce bravery and his brilliant strategy on the battlefield. He was familiar with the adrenaline-fueled exhilaration of exerting his power and his strength and his courage over others in battle. But governing is profoundly different than conquering. Instead of the physical strength and the raw courage of a warrior, David was now engaged in the subtle craft of statesmanship. Something that involved delicate negotiations and compromise and consensus building. Perhaps the impotence that David experienced as he made this transition from commander to king had something to do with the arousal that he felt when he gazed upon Bathsheba's beauty. Or perhaps if David had become curious, he might have been mindful of the impact that his sudden rise to fame and fortune was having on his ego. For the first time in his life, David found himself at the top of the heap. This rural farm boy had ascended to the highest office in the land. Instead of being overlooked and ignored, David was now admired and adored by throngs of people who had granted him unprecedented power and authority. Instead of sleeping under the stars with his father's sheep, he was now ensconced in a palace surrounded by all of the trappings of wealth and prestige that he could imagine. He was surrounded by people who were eager to please him and curry his favor. Perhaps the impact of all that adoration had something to do with David's decision to summon Bathsheba to his bedroom. Or perhaps if David had become curious, he might have been mindful of the deep sadness and sorrow that he was carrying for all of the people that he had seen slain in battle under his command. What if David had taken the time to get in touch with the loneliness that he felt after Jonathan, his closest friend, was found slain on the field of battle? What if he had been quiet enough to become aware of how weary he was from the constant, life-threatening danger that he had been facing day after day, not only from the enemies that he faced on the battlefield, but also from Saul's aggression. Saul, that very person who had first taken him under his wing, the first commander of the army, who used to summon David to come and play on his lyre and soothe his troubled spirit. Saul, the person who once identified his love for David as being like that of his own son. Saul, the person who somehow became tormented with jealousy and rage so that he sought to kill David on many different occasions. Perhaps the unassuaged grief that David carried had something to do with the attraction that he felt as he gazed upon Bathsheba's beauty. None of those things excuse the decision that David made to initiate an illicit affair. None of them justify or even explain his behavior. But if David had become mindful of the things that were affecting him as he got up from his couch and ascended to the roof of his palace, then he might have chosen differently. Mindfulness allows us to act with greater intentionality. When we pause long enough to become aware of all of the things that are affecting us at any given moment, then the choices that we make become much more deliberate. We don't simply react to the emotions that we feel. We choose our responses with a greater clarity about what things are motivating our behavior and what consequences we anticipate. Mindfulness keeps us from behaving like laboratory rats who simply react to the things that stimulate us in our environment. It's one of the practices that help us live in faithful communion with each other and with God. When we pause long enough to become curious about the feelings and the reactions that we have, then we can choose to respond in ways that build authentic connections between us. We can choose to dare greatly to live wholehearted lives. Amen.